Today's show is sponsored by Cloud Academy. Listen up, y'all. This is a great offer. With everyone using the same cloud platforms, winning and losing comes down to having the best talent to build products better and faster. Cloud Academy is the training platform of choice for Fortune 500 companies and thousands of tech professionals around the world. Thousands of video courses, learning paths, practical hands-on labs in real-world cloud environments, Cloud Academy has tools designed to help teams assess, build, and validate critical cloud skills. Most importantly, Cloud Academy stays agile, challenging you with new content, labs, and tons of features that ensure your skills stay relevant and everyone can level up. They cover everything from cloud certifications to DevOps to security to programming languages. You can get started now at cloudacademy.com. For a limited time, Cloudcast listeners can lock in 50% off the monthly price for life. Just put in the coupon code CLOUDCAST at checkout. It's a great way to pursue certifications or just build cloud expertise. Again, that's cloudacademy.com and use the coupon code CLOUDCAST to lock in 50% off the monthly price.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. We continue to chug along through September here in the middle of September 2020. Let's get right to Cloud News of the Week. There are a couple of interesting stories going on this week. A lot of kind of big name news going on this week, but let's jump right into it. First and foremost, Snyk, S-N-Y-K, closed a $200 million Series D round of funding, looking to modernized security industry. Snyk has been a company who has gotten a lot of publicity, now taken quite a bit of funding, over almost $450 million in funding. So big round. Security continues to be a big concern. Snyk is really trying to revolutionize how that gets done. So congratulations to the team at Snyk. Second, and this is sort of feels like a retread of a story, but the U.S. Pentagon has re-awarded or kind of reaffirmed their awarding of the JEDI contract to Microsoft once again. There was some pushback from AWS that it wasn't properly awarded, that it was awarded under kind of false pretense, and maybe the U.S. government got involved in places that it shouldn't have. But Pentagon reaffirmed that it was awarding that 10-year, $10 billion contract to Microsoft. So interesting to see that happen. Third thing, NVIDIA, huge deal. NVIDIA is acquiring ARM. So SoftBank is selling their holdings in ARM to NVIDIA for $40 billion. SoftBank had acquired ARM for $31 billion back in 2016. So, made some money off of a deal over 4 years. SoftBank really trying to, right the ship after a bunch of, struggled and failed type of investments they made in the gig economy, things like WeWork and some other things. But huge deal in the chip space. You're now consolidating really kind of the emerging chipset for mobile and IoT and edge, and we're beginning to see ARM more and more in the public cloud. AWS making a big deal about ARM with their Graviton chips and so forth. So it will be very, very interesting to now see, NVIDIA with their expertise around, big data, machine learning, AI and ML and GPUs combining with ARM. And, now we have a market cap that is going to be bigger than Intel. So pretty interesting to see what's happening in the hardware space. And then finally, the last one, one that we've really, really been covering a lot, we're really digging into around TikTok. No, I'm not just sort of joking around with TikTok again. TikTok, it was awarded. This has been a weird one because there was a lot of talk about some U.S. company was going to buy the U.S. operations. It really was kind of coming down to Microsoft and Oracle. It seems like Microsoft sort of backed out at the last minute, or they weren't selected, whatever it was. This one got sort of interesting because ultimately Oracle was selected as the company, but they're not actually going to buy the U.S. operations. They're just going to be their American technology partner. And I think a lot of this is really driven by the fact that the Chinese government basically classified the algorithm for TikTok, the one that makes it so addictive for your kids and family members and so forth, as kind of government property, could not be exported. So in essence, anybody who was going to end up buying TikTok or the U.S. operations for TikTok was not going to get access to that algorithm. And so ultimately, it looks like Oracle is going to get a very, very new large cloud company on the Oracle Cloud. But outside of that, they may be doing some financing for the U.S. operations, but they're not actually going to own TikTok. So ended up being a lot of noise, a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing. And nobody really ended up buying TikTok because ultimately nobody was able to wrestle the algorithm away from ByteDance and from the Chinese government. So with that, once again, we are giving it probably way too much time on this show, but it was a big deal. It did make a lot of noise. But yeah, so a lot of money changing hands between Sneak and the U.S. Pentagon and NVIDIA, and then some money of undisclosed amounts changing hands with Oracle and TikTok. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. We're going to get to a very, very interesting conversation about identity and how identity is really changing and here in the sort of distributed identity and some things are changing here in the world of COVID and how we're sort of managing security in a world in which we really don't have borders anymore, and borders in terms of sort of, firewalls and sort of defined borders of where we work. So interesting conversation coming up right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by DivvyCloud. DivvyCloud protects cloud and container environments from policy violations, threats, IAM challenges, and misconfigurations. Types of misconfigurations that have cost enterprises a jaw-dropping $5 trillion over the last 2 years. DivvyCloud provides continuous security and compliance across all cloud service providers and containers, including AWS, GCP, Azure, Alibaba, and Kubernetes, providing a comprehensive view of what's in your cloud along with the tools and automation you need to manage it today. DivvyCloud is proving that security and innovation are not mutually exclusive, one customer at a time. Join innovative enterprises like Spotify, Fannie Mae, and Discovery, who have found the freedom to innovate securely without loss of control. To learn more, visit divvycloud.com/cloudcast. That's DivvyCloud.com/cloudcast to sign up for a free trial. DivvyCloud. Find your freedom to innovate. And we're back. And folks, as you know, obviously, we're all going through a lot of transition these days. We're working from home. We're not necessarily working from offices. We are interacting with our customers differently. We're interacting with our colleagues differently, our partners and so forth. And, what this means is that, from the perspective of the folks who have to help manage our infrastructure, manage the security, make sure that we can just do our jobs on a day-to-day basis, things are really different. And that means that security is different. Identity, how you log in, whether it's VPNs or some other thing, is all different. And so we thought, well, let's dig into that a little bit. Let's figure out what's really going on, what's changed in this world, and really kind of get into it. So excited to have Brian Johnson, who is Senior Vice President of Cloud Security Practice at Rapid7. Brian, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Always good to have another Brian on the show. You were formerly, not too long ago, CEO and co-founder at DivvyCloud, recently purchased by Rapid7. Give us a little bit of kind of an overview of what's going on in the managed managed security provider world, and kind of what's going on in your world with all these changes going on. Mostly, the world has become totally different in the last 6 months.
Yeah, that's a good question. So certainly one of the things we've seen is an acceleration of cloud adoption. Cloud's been around for about a decade, a little bit longer, and adoption of cloud has come in waves. You had earlier adoption was mostly driven by startups, younger companies, and now as we get into this more mature part of cloud adoption, it's a lot more larger enterprises who are sort of making that shift and see the value. And we would have originally predicted that transition was going to take place over the next 5 years as we go through this tail. But COVID really stepped that up because it really forced people out of the office, obviously. Rapid7 is all work from home right now, for example. And so that forcing people out of the office made them rethink how it is that their employees not only engage their own internal systems, but how their external systems are engaged and how they're used. You can't go into the data center as easily as you used to. So these companies are really accelerating their cloud adoption. This has caused them to really focus in on how people gain access to their resources, specifically around identity. But even more so, as they adopt more and more cloud resources, identity in the cloud is very different than traditional identity. And so they're sort of wrestling with, what does that mean? How do I take advantage of it? And more importantly, how do I make sure that my company is able to continue to move at the velocity it needs to, especially around innovation, without losing security and governance and all the things that come with that IT used to bring to the equation?
Yeah. I was thinking about it because, as we're all living with it, right? You used to have all sorts of kind of physical things that identified where you were. Maybe it was a badge reader to get you in a building. You were in a physical location. Sure, there were things like VPNs and other stuff, but I feel like everything has become distributed. And in that context, is identity now the sort of the new security perimeter? I mean, how are people beginning to think about, how do I keep track of, 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 people scattered all over? But like you said, there still needs to be some structure for doing that. Does identity become the center of where that security starts?
Yeah, it's a good question. So with our focus on cloud, it's important to draw the distinction between what would be considered traditional identity or identity access management. And this is sort of your two-factor authentication. How do I log in? How do I get access? That's sort of one side of identity. When it comes to cloud, and this is something that a lot of enterprises are discovering, is that there's a second segment of identity, and that is in the cloud world, all of your infrastructure, whether it be servers or Lambda methods or databases, they all have identities associated with them. And utilizing cloud permission sets, you can actually grant access to those resources. So not to people, but to like a machine, to be able to have access to do certain things inside the infrastructure. And that's a second set of identity that's sort of new to our world. It's something that we haven't really been able to do quite the way we are now. It's very software-defined identity. In previous worlds, or previous times rather, not previous worlds, that's sort of weird, we would have used things like firewalls and IP addresses and subnetting and all sort of traditional networking to grant access to a system, to grant privilege to, for one server to talk to another server. Now we're leveraging those same techniques. That still happens. But now we're layering in a piece on top of them. We're saying, also inside of these cloud providers, you can offer and provide access to a resource through what the cloud providers are calling IAM, which is identity access management. It's a little overloaded because identity access management has been something that's been around for a long time. We've talked about that mostly in relation to people and how they access things. And now we're overloading and saying, well, it's not just about how people access things. It's about how systems access other systems. And that's where things are sort of really starting to get complicated in the industry.
Yeah. No, I I see that a lot with myself. I do a lot of day job stuff with Kubernetes, and it's figuring out key management and permissions and authentication, just even within systems within the systems. Yeah, I'm definitely seeing an explosion around that. For folks who don't live in this space all the time, can you kind of walk us through, what are some of the different systems? I hear IAM systems, I hear privilege access management or PAM, I hear, identity governance or IGA. Like, can you kind of frame up for us, like, what are these different systems? What are the kind of the terminologies go along with them? Where do they kind of fit in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a little bit of it is that the market is sort of flailing a little bit to try and get their footing because it's just become such an overloaded term, IAM, and it means so many different things, and it can mean so many different perspectives based on your world. Do you live in the traditional identity space, two-factor authentication, authorization, access management as it relates to people? Do you live in the cloud infrastructure space? Do you live in the Kubernetes space? And all of those sort of mean it's all overloaded. I think the way we try to look at it is that identity access management is an overarching umbrella that says, we are going to look at the topic of how do people and systems get granted permission and authorization to do certain activities. And then under that umbrella, you sort of break it out into people versus infrastructure. And the people side of it is very much your Duos, it's your Oktas, it's all the things out there that are helping you manage your employees and their access to your systems and other SaaS systems, Salesforce and DocuSign, that kind of stuff. And then there's this other side, which is the cloud infrastructure side, which is the part that we predominantly deal with. And that is the, again, IAM, but in this case, you're really referring to permissive access and identity governance around how do I ensure that as I'm deploying applications into the cloud, that those applications are sitting on top of resources that are, provide the proper permissions. And there's also another element called least privilege access, which is not only does it provide the proper permissions for that asset to do whatever it needs to do, but are we making sure that it's not overly permissive in what it does? And actually, if we look at the industry, specifically in the technology space on the cloud side, we're starting to see the effects of not doing the governance properly. So if we look at Capital One is the classic example, right? They had this breach, it was last year, and it was a really interesting breach because that breach in particular lived at the center of traditional vulnerabilities, so vulnerability management and dealing with the fact that Apache had a vulnerability in it, and it overlapped with sort of the IAM world we live in today in cloud, which is the resource that was compromised have been granted permissions at the cloud layer saying anything that lives on this server can access these other things inside of my cloud. In this case, it turned out to be a bunch of S3 buckets. And the user was able to, in this case, the person who compromised this asset was able to compromise the asset and then essentially take the fact that they were on that server and leverage that to their advantage so that they could start to access other things inside the infrastructure. And the mistake that was made there from Capital One's perspective was that the access they had granted that server, not the person, right? Because it was just a server, was too permissive. It gave them access to things they just didn't need to access. And so that user was able to leverage that and to go get stuff that normally they wouldn't be able to get. And so it really is, as we start to go through that and we break it down, identity access management is the overarching umbrella. You have traditional identity, which is your more authentication stuff, and you have your cloud-based identity, which is the stuff we just covered. And inside of that, you have permission sets and least privilege access and all sorts of things.
Gotcha. No, it makes sense. I can imagine, it was one thing when you had physical barriers, then you started to have sort of, virtual things, like you said, like firewalls and other stuff. At one point you were dealing with individuals. Now we're dealing with, like permissions of accounts, permissions of devices, permissions of, do those tend to still all fall under kind of CISO level, under CISO level groups, or with so many groups that now go off and acquire their own SaaS on their own, or, spin up an AWS account, are like individual application groups having to kind of consume these types of skills and responsibilities, or how are you seeing that sort of shake out at different companies?
Look, it's a complicated question, because sometimes you'll hear, the whole industry, because it's moving so fast, we don't have the time allotted to us to name things properly so that we can group them. So, for example, people talk about cloud. Well, in some circles, that means, in our world, that means traditional infrastructure and the cloud model. So Amazon, Azure, GCP. But in other circles, cloud can mean SaaS. It can mean Salesforce. It can mean OneBox. It can mean Google Drive. It can mean Gmail even. So it just depends on how you think about cloud. And I think a lot of that does, from a security standpoint, it is sort of all bubbling up under the CISO office. But inside of the CISO office, you're starting to see segmentation of responsibility. You have your traditional security, which does tend to deal more with on-prem data center network security. You have your cloud center of excellence, which deals predominantly more with your infrastructure cloud, so AWS, GCP, Azure. And now we're starting to see more SaaS governance teams, which are dealing more with the governance of SaaS in general. I've got 50 SaaS offerings. I want to make sure they're all using single sign-on. I want to make sure that I understand the permission sets, that we are, taking a centralized mechanism of authentication and letting it flow down into my different SaaS providers so that I can ensure that my users have the permission they need. And the thing is that we've had 30 years or more to perfect the sort of data center identity stuff that we've been dealing with, firewalls, all that kind of stuff we deal with in more traditional assets. The cloud side of things, as I mentioned, is really in infrastructure as code anyway. Infrastructure, let me back up. For infrastructure as a service, so meaning your IaaS providers, that's only been around for about 10 years. And moving email into, in a big way into like Gmail and using somebody's code, that's also only been around for about 10 years. So we're really sort of moving towards, how do we deal with this? How do we embrace this and make sure that we can take all the learnings we had from our 30 years or plus experience into this new world where maybe it's 15 years, I'm not sure exactly the time frames, but it's much less, and we're having to do it much faster. And I think that's causing a lot of heartburn for the infrastructure. Yeah, no, it makes sense. It's I always say that, we don't, it's not that we've ever lacked for the technology. It's just that the stuff comes faster than we ever did. And I think you're kind of reinforcing that, especially when we think about the time windows we're dealing with. I know for myself all the time and accounts that I deal with, everybody always says, look, get two-factor authentication, avoid being hacked, avoid being impersonated. How does sort of multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication kind of apply when we're dealing with these sort of non-individual accounts, right? Is there a way, is that
apply when there's not another human getting a text message and putting in something? Is there an equivalency, or is that just another kind of complexity to these whole systems?
Well, and so I think from the identity side of the person side, we're starting to see more movement. I mean, two-factor authentication is a great approach to solving a problem for making sure that you're being secure. Although certainly, when we do this sort of tit-for-tat battle with offensive defense, you're always playing a game of the hackers trying to get ahead of what you're doing. And they're starting to find ways to do things like, SMS text capture and sort of being man in the middle on that. And so we've had to move slightly further in that into like device related two-factor stuff. So, can I install an app that's going to give me a notification that allows me to approve a sign on my phone, all those kinds of things, right? And so we're moving in that direction. And that's going to continue to become more and more sophisticated as we move that forward. Single sign-ons will become more important. And we're starting to see things like Microsoft and Google put things in place where we're like, well, you don't even need to have, passwords necessary. We're trying to move to a passwordless future where it's just by sort of a full trust of your device and these kinds of things, you can get to a better place. On the cloud side of things, specifically on the infrastructure side, we're seeing the IAM world mature. We're starting to see these cloud providers become more mature in their approach to identity access management. With that, however, comes complexity. And for example, in AWS, you can use these IAM policies to control the most granular of things. This one server can call this very specific API call, blah, 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 this region, right? You can sort of really get down to something very, very granular. What the industry's running into, though, is that complexity or that granularity is becoming almost too much for the corporation to understand. I had a friend of mine who works at a large company and focuses on identity say, his perspective is there's about maybe 20,000 people in the entire United States who actually truly understand how identity is supposed to operate inside of cloud. Right. And that's 20,000 seems like a lot, but it's really not for what we're trying to deal with. And from that perspective, what's happening is becoming more complex. It's becoming more granular. It's changing incredibly fast. And so new permissions and new things are being added into the identity model sort of space. And that's just in one cloud. You then sort of brand across all three clouds or all five, if you want to sort of look at it, but like Azure and GCP and AWS, and they're all doing it slightly differently. And so it becomes incredibly challenging for these organizations to manage and govern their identity inside of a cloud space like that, because there's so much nuance, because it moves so fast. And I'll add on to that, the last thing to think about, in the traditional identity space, when you're dealing with people, yes, organizations hire and fire people at a reasonable clip, but it's pretty predictable, and it sort of follows this, ebb and flow on a monthly, quarterly basis as you think about it, right? And you can actually sort of stagnate when you're onboarding people and follow an onboarding process pretty well organized and controlled. In cloud, as we see it today, because of things like CI/CD, because the engineering teams are taking a more active role in deploying infrastructure, those changes to identities and to policies that are being leveraged in your cloud environment are changing on a minute-by-minute basis inside of your cloud. We have a customer of ours that sees 20,000 changes to their infrastructure every hour.
Wow.
And you can sort of say, well, how many of those are identity? What are those policies? What are people making modifications? And so it's different, because in the traditional identity space, you have a little more control over when you're bringing people on, when you're onboarding them and stuff. In the cloud space, you really have to find a way to deal with the speed of innovation and the speed at which these engineers are moving forward. And you really can't get in the way of what they're doing, because then you're breaking innovation, and now you're not going to be as competitive. And so how do we find a way to allow engineers and these engineering teams to do IAM inside of cloud in a way that allows them to continue to innovate while not exposing ourselves to, systems that have way more access than they need, so that if they get compromised, all of a sudden the sort of blast radius of that is impossible to track. So it's just a much more complex problem to try and solve.
Right. And for the company that might come to you, because we are seeing large percentage of companies who talk about using multiple clouds, and like you said, that could be AWS and Azure, it could be Salesforce, it could be whatever. I mean, like, what sort of guidance? Because and again, none of this is because people just want to rack up the number of clouds that they're working on. It's, there's a business reason for doing it. SaaS is becoming more prevalent, all those things. Like, how do you, if somebody comes to you and says like, hey, how do I deal with the fact that they're all a little bit different, right? Like, it's not just all Active Directory, or it's not just all, certain brand of firewall. Like, how do you has, talked to somebody about saying like, here's how you deal with the variation that goes on for something that is just two-factor or IAM or whatever it might be?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think so. Prior to starting DivvyCloud, my co-founder and I used to work for Electronic Arts, and we managed and ran a lot of these massive multiplayer online games. We worked on Warhammer Online and Star Wars: The Old Republic and a whole bunch of other things. These very large online games, and that required us to have these sort of massive, 6 data centers, 12 data centers worth of hardware around the world, and trying to manage that deployment. And one of the things I learned through that process was when you're dealing at scale with that kind of thing, standardization is key. Because you're going to have N number of people working on those systems. You're going to have X number of people touching them and having input and that kind of stuff. So you're woken up in the middle of the night for all these different things. You need to find a way to standardize. This problem we're facing today is no different. As the industry moves forward, I encourage all of our customers to find ways to standardize their policies, standardize how they approach cloud, standardize these things so that they can begin to formulate more holistic strategies and approaches. You're not going to have a lot of success in saying, well, I'm just going to fly by the seat of my pants, and we're going to adopt Google, and we're going to adopt Azure, and we're going to adopt GCP, and I'm going to try and build strategies for each one of those cloud providers. We're going to adopt two different two-factor authentication providers or single sign-on providers. And you just end up with this sea of complexity that your customers can understand, that your employees can understand. So you really need to take a strategic position and say, I'm going to standardize on these sets of technologies, and I'm going to make them available in a self-service model to my customers, whether that be employees of the company or to people that are actually your customers. And so finding that standardization ground, building out a strategy around how you're going to develop policy that's going to guide you more holistically across these different problems is really, really critical. And so as the industry moves forward, we're going to start to see some commoditization of certain things. Like I'll use infrastructure. We're seeing Kubernetes, as you mentioned, you spent some time there. Kubernetes is getting a lot of adoption, and it's going to ultimately force commoditize the infrastructure as a service market. And Google's hope is that you will use that as the single entry point into deploying applications, no matter what cloud you're going inside of. I would expect that as the identity access world, specifically in cloud, gets more and more sophisticated, you will start to see vendors like ours moving towards trying to standardize that model. So that when you're enforcing policies like this asset can't do X, Y, or Z, or can do N, that you can do that in a standard way that works in all 3 clouds or all 5 clouds, so that you can build a strategy, posture, and a policy. And I think that's going to be critical to our success here.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. I want to ask you one last question, and I'm not sure if this is a big question or one that we can kind of squeeze in a little bit. I hear a whole bunch these days, and especially now that everybody's distributed, about sort of zero trust, unified zero trust, these security models. Again, we're getting into these non-perimeters. Can you kind of talk a little bit about what that means, and maybe some of the things that you guys are working on at Rapid7 and previously at DivvyCloud to kind of be in that space for customers that are interested in this new model of security?
Yeah, I mean, look, this model of security really moves around the idea that there was 2 ways of thinking about this problem set philosophically. One is we're going to force everyone to go through this centralized point of authentication, this gatekeeping model. That was the traditional IT model that sort of broke when cloud came along. This other model sort of says, well, we're going to give you access to do what you need to do, but we're going to verify absolutely everything you're going to handle. And we're going to do that through tokens, through location, through device, through lots of different ways. But every single thing you do, we're going to track. And we're going to validate that it is what it's supposed to be. And that really starts to become a big data problem. So, for example, in the identity space, where we're looking at where we're going to take the technology that DivvyCloud has already done, which is predominantly focused on governance and cloud security posture management around what your assets, how they're configured in the cloud, and validating every single thing you have to make sure that it meets your policy, regardless of who created it. So you're not trusting the person. You're just going to look at everything. Same thing's going on in identity. We're looking at every single API transaction that's made, every single policy that's made. We're validating it against the where it's coming from, who it's coming from, what it's doing. Is it supposed to do that? Does it make sense? Is it falling outside of the standard boundaries of what you've seen in the past? Using behavioral analytics. All of that has to come to fruition if we're going to allow the companies to continue to innovate at the speed that they're innovating, we have to find ways to be more on the sidelines and be watching everything that's going on and just validating every single activity they're making.
Interesting. Yeah, a lot of extra work, but obviously I can see where that flexibility comes in terms of just dealing with the new world of where people work, how they work, how the applications work. So very cool. Yeah. So Brian, I'm gonna wrap up there. You guys have been going through this transition from DivvyCloud to Rapid7. What's kind of the best way for folks to engage with the team and where you're doing interesting new things?
Sure. I mean, certainly our website at DivvyCloud.com is the best place to go to engage around cloud security posture management. However, Rapid7, and this is one of the reasons we did the acquisition with them, is holistically moving in a cloud security direction. And so I encourage you to go check out all of our Insight platform, rapid7.com, of which we are a part of, to see all the different components, because what we see is a future where in order for you to be able to truly understand the risk of your cloud infrastructure, you need to know vulnerability management, you need to know behavioral analytics, you need to know posture management, you need to know identity, and it needs to be all in one place. And so I would encourage you to go to rapid7.com to learn more about our Insight platform, where we're taking that, and how we're going to bring a holistic risk and total infrastructure strategy to the market.
Very cool. We'll get all that in the show notes for folks that are listening. Brian, as always, thank you so much for the time today. We learned a ton. Folks, as always, we appreciate you listening. We appreciate you telling a friend and giving us feedback on iTunes and all the other sort of places where you're getting your podcasts. So for Aaron and myself, we will thank you very much, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.